Hi there, and welcome to the second part of this reading. I do want to give an update. I don't know if individuals may have caught it, but in the first part, I did reference to the author as he in the initial part of the reading. Later on, corrected myself as the author is female. So I just want to recognize that and put that out there. Take a breath as we are settling into the continuation of this reading. White supremacy culture is still here. Again, this is part 2. And we're going to continue on with the section either or and the binary. It reads, this characteristic explores our cultural assumption that we can and should reduce the complexity of life and the nuances of our relationships with each other and all living things into either/or, yes or no, right or wrong in ways that reinforce toxic power. And so here we have a section with that saying either/or in the binary shows up as bullet points listed. The either or binary shows up as positioning or presenting options or issues as either or, good, bad, right, wrong, with us or against us. And show up as little or no sense of the possibilities of both and. Trying to simplify complex things, for example, believing that poverty is simply a result of lack of education. It shows up as closely linked to perfectionism because binary thinking makes it difficult to learn from mistakes or accommodate conflict. Conflict and an increased sense of urgency, as people feel they have to make decisions to do either this or that, with no time or encouragement to consider alternatives, particularly those which may require more time or resources. Either or in the binary shows up as a strategy used by those with a clear agenda or goal to push those who are still thinking or reflecting to make a choice between A or B, without acknowledging a need for time and creativity to come up with more options. The last point under the either or and the binary shows up as a strategy used to pit oppressions against each other rather than to recognize the ways in which racism and classism intersect, the ways in which both intersect the heterosexism and ageism and other categories of oppression. Antidotes or suggestions for how to show up in more connecting and healing ways include, so there are bullet points to these antidotes. The first would be, notice when you or others use either or language and make time to come up with more than 2 alternatives. Notice when you or others are simplifying complex issues, particularly when the stakes seem high or an urgent decision needs to be made. When urgency arises and binary thinking emerges, slow down and encourage people to take a pause, breath, restate the goal, and dive deeper into alternatives. When you or others are faced with an urgent decision, take a break and offer some breathing room to think creatively and allow intuitive wisdom to arise. Avoid making decisions under extreme pressure and work to distinguish what is actual pressure and what is pressure that you or others are creating. Last point for antidotes or suggestions for how to show up in more connecting and healing ways include avoid trying to assign a single cause to a problem or a challenge. Acknowledge the ways in which oppressions intersect and reinforce each other, as well as the ways in which oppression can be operating at the interpersonal, institutional, and cultural levels. With that, let's take a breath. The next section here is progress is bigger/more and quantity over quality. It reads, These characteristics explore our cultural assumption that the goal is to always to be, do, get more, and to be, do, get bigger. This leads to an emphasis on what we can objectively measure, how well we are doing at being, doing, getting more, as well as more valuable than the quality of our relationships to all living beings. So here we have progress, underlined and bolded. It says is narrowly defined as bigger and more. It shows up as, here are more bullet points. Progress shows up as how we define success. Success is always bigger or more. It shows up as an organization that assumes the goal is to grow, add staff, add projects, or serve more people regardless of how well they can serve them, raise more money, or gain more influence and power for its own sake, all without regard to the organization's mission, or especially the people and or living beings that the organization is in relationship with. Progress shows up as gives no value, not even negative value to its cost. For example, increase accountability to funders as the budget grows in ways that leave those served exploited, excluded, or underserved as we focus on how we are serving instead of the quality of service or values created by the ways in which we serve. Little or no ability to consider the cost of growth in social, emotional, psychic, embodied, spiritual, and financial realms. Progress shows up as a narrow focus on numbers, such as financial, people, geography, power, without an ability to value processes, such as relationships, including costs to the human and natural environment. It shows up as valuing those who have progressed over those who have not, where progress is measured in degrees, grades, money, power, status, material belongings, in ways that erase lived experience and wisdom/knowledge that is invisibilized. Tending, cleaning, feeding, nurturing, caring for, raising up, supporting. Author gives thanks to Bevelin Uka. The last part of how that kind of progress can show up is if the focus on getting bigger in size, transactional power, or numbers, leading to little or no ability to consider the cost of getting big in social, emotional, psychic, embodied, spiritual, and financial realms. Next little subsection says quantity over quality. Defines it shows up as, here are more bullet points. So quantity over quality shows up as most or all resources directed towards producing quantitatively measurable goals. Things that can be counted are more highly valued than things that cannot. For example, numbers of people attending a meeting, newsletter circulation, money raised and spent are valued more than quality of relationships, democratic decision-making, ability to constructively deal with conflict, morale, and mutual support. Little or no value attached to the process in the internalized belief that if it can't be measured, it has no value. Shows up as discomfort with emotion and feelings. Little or no understanding that when there is a conflict between content, the agenda of the meeting, and process, people's need to be heard or engaged, process will prevail. For example, you may get through the agenda, but if you haven't paid attention to people's need to be heard, the decisions made at the meeting are undermined and or disregarded. Quantity over quality shows up as connected to perfectionism, one right way, I am the only one. The right to comfort because of the ways in which process, which cannot be numerically measured, requires emotional presence and intelligence, whereas product, when it can be numerically measured, feels safe and controllable. The last point for quantity over quality is short-term thinking, urgency thinking, either or thinking, and the consuming effort to meet unrealistic quantitative goals or numbers. Here we have anecdotes, and those include, with bullet points here, and I'm not going to be able to say this. I know some people know this reference to this word, but it says include honoring the ancient Haudunasnisi. It's a philosophy that the decisions we make today should result in a sustainable world 7 generations into the future. If I hear that word, I know it, but I don't know how to pronounce it. But yes, so where we have the decisions we make today should result in a sustainable world 7 generations into the future. Other anecdotes include ensure that any cost/benefit analysis includes all the costs, not just the financial ones. For example, the cost in morale, the cost in credibility, the cost in relationship to living beings, the cost and use of resources. Include include process goals. So include process goals in your planning. For example, make sure that your goals speak to how you want to do your work, not just what you want to do. Ask those you work with and for to establish goals and evaluate performance holistically. For example, set both content and process goals, what you do and how you do it, aligned with the values of organization and or community. Make sure you and your community or organization has a value statement that expresses the ways in which you want to do your work. Create this as a living document that people use in their day-to-day work. Look for ways to measure process goals. For example, if you have a goal of mutually respectful relationships, think about ways you can measure how you are living into that goal. Learn to recognize those times when you need to go off the planned agenda in order to address people's underlying concerns, with the knowledge that doing so will result in more solid product in the long run. Distinguish between growth, which is necessary and organic, and the conditioned desire for more. More stuff, more transactional power, more people, more for its own sake. The last anecdote here listed is consider adding measures that keep you grounded in what's important. How many times did we laugh together today? How many times did we express gratitude? How many times did we allow silence? How many times did we allow dissent? The next section here is worship of the written word. And it reads, this characteristic explores our cultural habit of honoring only what is written and only what is written to a narrow standard, even when what is written is full of misinformation and lies. Worship of the written word includes erasure of the wide range in which we communicate with each other and all living beings. I want to acknowledge that this characteristic is one that angers many people who believe that I am saying that worship of the written word is the same as the ability to write well. They claim that I am implying that BIPOC people and communities cannot achieve a high standard of written expression, whatever standard of high might be in the reader's mind. They believe I am suggesting that if worshiping the written word is a white supremacy culture value, then only white people are capable of writing well. That is not what I mean. This characteristic has to do with how white supremacy culture requires things to be written down on its own terms in order to preserve power. For example, the US invaded Mexico in 1846 to start what would become known as the Mexican-American War. The war ended with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo 2 years later. The treaty transferred over 55% of Mexican land to the US. This is present-day Arizona, California, New Mexico, Texas, parts of Colorado, Nevada, and Utah. The treaty promised to protect the lands, language, and culture of the Mexican people and communities living in the ceded territory. But Congress substituted a protocol which required people of Mexican heritage to prove legitimate title to their lands in court. Unable to provide proof in a culture that did not record land transactions, the protocol became the legal basis for white settlers to claim rights and seize land from Mexicans in these territories. Our history is replete with the theft of land, of bodies, of culture, of skin and blood and ancestry through manipulation of the written word. Take a very quick pause from this reading and just add in a little bit more blurb here. The United States set up surveying after we started to take over indigenous lands, and those surveys were on our terms. And so this is the same kind of way that the settlers had taken to just really take control of the land and region. That here's our way of mapping things out. If you want to have land, tell us based on what we designed and created without you ever participating in it. You have to tell us based on what we created, and we could tell you that you're wrong. That just seems, just think about that for a moment. All right, so I'm going to continue reading. It says, for example, in order for any of us to access resources, and particularly for those who are poor or working class, we are required to fill out endless forms that we did not design and did not have any say in designing. These forms do not reflect the complexity and richness of who we are. Yet we are constantly told that if we do not provide information on the forms, then we will not be able to access the resources that may or may not be available to us. Whoever and whatever we might actually want to share about ourselves does not matter or even exist. The wealthier and whiter and more cisgender male we are, the less we have to account for ourselves on other people's terms, in writing or at all. The wealthier and whiter and more cisgender male we are, the more we can count on legally written words to protect our interests, in large part because we have more power to determine what the legally written words will be. A final example, I'm often asked to cite a final example, I'm often asked to cite the sources that I use to write the article on which this website is based. The request often comes from people with less power who are trying to use the article to generate conversation and action towards a racial equity commitment in their organizations or communities. They want to know if I can provide citations or sources so that the article have more legitimacy to those in power. I get this request so often that I have created a one-pager to send a response. See the website. The underlying assumption is that if a written piece reflects some level of wisdom, lived experience, or other worldview that is not properly vetted, then that piece has little or no value to those who consider themselves the gatekeepers of legitimate knowledge. There are so many ways of knowing. Writing them down according to a single grammatical standard with a singular set of rules about what makes that knowledge legitimate is one of the many ways to erase and control information, culture, wisdom, knowing, insight, intuition. Worship of the written word has nothing to do with the ability to write well, and writing well comes with a wide range of approaches, styles, languages. Those who engage in repeated code switching understand this very well. And so here we have the written worship of the written word shows up as, here's some bullet points to consider. If it's not in a memo, it doesn't exist. If it's not grammatically correct, it has no value. If it's not properly cited according to academic rules that many people don't know or have access to, it's not legitimate. An ability to, or refusal to acknowledge information that is shared through stories, embodied knowing, intuition, and the wide range of ways in which we individually and collectively learn and know. Continued frustration that people and communities don't respond to written communication, blaming people and communities for their failure to respond. Those with strong documentation and writing skills are more highly valued, even in organizations where ability to relate to others is key to the mission. Collectively and generationally informed in a context where systematic racism privileges the writing and wisdom of people in the white group. Academic standards require original work when our knowledge and knowing almost always builds on the knowing and knowledge of others, of each other. The last point here for worship of the written word shows up as claiming ownership of written word to meet ego needs rather than understanding the importance of offering what you write and know to grow and expand the community's knowing. And here we have antidotes. Antidotes to the worship of the written word include more bullet points. Take the time to analyze how people inside and outside the organization get and share information. Figure out what actually needs to be written down and come up with the alternative ways to document what is happening. Encourage creative ways of documenting or recording or reflecting what you are learning and how and what you feel you know. Work to reorganize the contribution and skills that every person brings to organization. For example, the ability to build relationships with those who are important to the organization's mission. Make sure anything written can be clearly understood. Avoid academic language, buzzwords, acronyms, etc. Develop your skills individually and collectively to gather information through different ways of knowing. Identify when circumstances require documentation on others' terms, and bring transparency to how you respond, like legal documents, funder applications, government forums, etc. Dedicate time to practicing and honoring other ways of knowing and expression. Oral storytelling, embodied learning, visual and movement art, silence, meditation, singing, dancing. The author gives thanks to Christina Rivera Chapman. More bullet points include practice listening because our culture doesn't value oral traditions or storytelling wisdom. We are out of listening practice, remembering how to hold a spoken word with weight without having to write it down. A few more points here. Acknowledge and honor diverse and interconnected sources of wisdom. Honor the value of collaborative and collective knowledge. And the last antidote to the worship of the written word includes appreciate when others learn from and expand on your knowledge and writing. See yourself and position yourself as one person in a stream of knowing and learning. Take a breath. Our next section, as I say, individualism, and I'm the only one. So it reads under there, it says, these characteristics look at our cultural assumption that individualism in our cultural story, or that individualism is our cultural story, that we make it on our own, or should, without help, by pulling ourselves up by our own bootstraps. Our cultural attachment to individualism leads to toxic denial of our essential interdependence and the reality that we are all in this, literally, together. So individualism shows up as, for white people, seeing yourselves and or demanding to be seen as an individual and not as part of the white group. Failure to acknowledge any of the ways dominant identities such as gender, class, sexuality, religion, able-bodiedness, age, education, to name a few, are informed by belonging to a dominant group that shapes cultural norms and behavior. So read that one more time. Failure to acknowledge any of the ways that dominant identities are informed by belonging to a dominant group that shapes cultural norms and behavior. For BIPOC people, individualism forces the classic double bind when BIPOC people are accused of not being team players. In other words, punishment or repercussions for acting as an individual if and when doing so threatens the team. For white people, a culturally supported focus on determining whether an individual is racist or not while ignoring cultural, institutional, and systemic racism. The strongly felt need by many, if not most, white people to claim they are not racist, while their conditioning into racism is relentless and unavoidable. For white people, a belief that you are responsible for and are qualified to solve problems on your own. For BIPOC people, being blamed and shamed for acting to solve problems without checking in and asking for permission from white people. Little experience or comfort working as part of a team, which includes both failure to acknowledge the genius or creativity of others on the team and a willingness to sacrifice democratic and collaborative processes in favor of efficiency. See double bind for BIPOC people above. Desire for individual recognition and credit. Failure to acknowledge how what we know is informed by so many others. Isolation and loneliness. Valuing competition more highly than cooperation, or collaboration is valued, little time or resources are devoted to developing skills and how to collaborate and cooperate. More points for individualism showing up includes accountability, if any, goes up and down, not sideways to peers or those organization is set up to serve. A lack of accountability, as organization values those who can get things done on their own without needing supervision or guidance, unless and until doing so or doing things on our own threatens power. Very connected to one right way, perfectionism, qualified, and defensiveness and denial. Here we have I'm the only one shows up as. So here is the next section of underneath all that individualism and I'm the only one. Bullet points have an aspect of individualism, the belief that if something is going to get done right, I have to do it. Connected to the characteristic of one right way, the belief that I can determine the right way. I'm entitled and or qualified to do so, in isolation from and without accountability to those impacted by how I define the right way. Little or no ability to delegate work to others. Micromanagement. based in deep fear of loss and control, which requires an illusion of control. Putting charismatic leaders on pedestals, or positioning yourself as a charismatic leader on a pedestal. Romanticizing a leader or yourself as the center of a movement, idea, issue, campaign. Hiding or covering up the flaws of a leader or your flaws in fear that the organization, movement, or effort cannot survive. The last point for I'm the only one shows up as defining leadership as those most in front and most vocal. We have some antidotes. Antidotes to individualism and I'm the only way include more bullet points. Seek to understand all the ways we are informed by our dominant identities and how our membership to dominant identity groups informs us both overtly and covertly. Or realizing too that these identities do not have to define us. Understand how membership in a dominant group, the white group, the male group, the hetero group, the wealthy group, extends psychic, spiritual, and emotional benefits as well as material benefits. Seek to understand how these benefits are, in reality, toxic because our complacency with being positioned as both better and normal requires that we dehumanize all those designated as less than and abnormal. Acknowledge that all white people have internalized racist conditioning and that an anti-racist commitment is not about being good or bad. It's about figuring out what we are going to do about our conditioning. Do our personal work while also bringing focus to institutional and systemic manifestations of white supremacy and racism. Antidotes to individualism and I'm the only way continues to include name teamwork and collaboration as an important personal and group value. Acknowledge that teamwork and collaboration take more time, particularly at the front end, and yield a better result with higher buy-in and higher ability to take shared risks. Make sure the group organization is working towards the shared goals that have been collaboratively developed and named. Reward people for collaborating. Evaluate the ability to work in a team as well as the ability to get things done. Honor process as much as product. Honor how you do things as much as what you do or produce. Make sure that credit is given to all who participate in an effort, not just the leaders or most public person. Make sure that when you are given credit, you distribute it to all those who have helped you with whatever was accomplished. Create collective accountability rather than individual accountability. Create a culture where people feel that they can bring problems to the group. Use meetings as a place to solve problems, not just as a place to report activities. Hold ourselves accountable to the principle of collective thinking and action. Develop the ability to collaborate and delegate to others. In workspaces or movement efforts, evaluate performance based on an ability to work as part of a team to accomplish shared goals. Almost done here with the antidotes to individualism and I'm the only way include hold ourselves and each other accountable to a shared definition of leadership that assumes a collaborative and collective approach. Hold ourselves and leaders accountable for mistakes without assuming that we need to be perfect to lead. Develop collaborative and collective strategies for how to respond to mistakes and encourage learning from the mistakes, appropriate boundary setting, and restorative approaches. Realize that leadership is dynamic and does not rest in one individual. We are called upon to lead at different times and different circumstances, and called upon to follow or take a back seat when we are learning or making room for new leadership to emerge. Let's take a deep breath. Next, we have defensiveness and denial. It reads, defensiveness and denial reflects our cultural dis-ease with truth-telling, particularly when we are speaking truth to power. White supremacy culture encourages a habit of denying and defending any speaking to or about it. White supremacy culture encourages encourages a habit of silence about things that matter, and as a collective of artists fighting the AIDS epidemic would had so wisely and succinctly said, silence equals death. So here we have defensiveness shows up as, with bullet points. The organizational structure is set up in much energy spent trying to prevent abuse and protect power rather than to facilitate the capacities of each person or to clarify who has power and how they're expected to use it. Because of the either or and binary thinking, those in power view and or experience criticism as threatening and inappropriate or rude. People respond to new or challenging ideas with objections or criticism, making it very difficult to raise these ideas. People in the organization, particularly those with power, spend a lot of energy trying to make sure that their feelings aren't getting hurt, forcing others to work around their defensiveness rather than addressing them head on. At its worst, they have convinced others to do this work for them. Defensiveness shows up as white people spend energy defending against charges of racism instead of examining how racism might actually be happening. White people claim that the participation in anti-racist activity means they cannot be racist or be engaged in racism, closely linked to individualism. White people targeted by other oppressions express resentment because they experience the naming of racism as erasing their experience, closely linked to the either or binary thinking. The last point for defensiveness and how it shows up is an oppressive culture where people are afraid to speak their truth. Antidotes or suggestions for how to show up in more connecting and healing ways include: understand that structure cannot, in and of itself, facilitate or prevent abuse. Understand the link between defensiveness and fear of losing power, losing face, losing comfort, losing privilege. Work on your own defensiveness. Ask yourself, what are you defending against and why? Develop a culture of naming defensiveness as a problem when it becomes one. Set up brainstorming and other sessions designed to consider ideas ahead of time by naming defensiveness as a behavior or attitude the group wants to name and avoid. Give people credit for being able to handle more than you think. In other words, avoid deciding what someone can or cannot hear, particularly if you don't have evidence. When someone responds defensively, ask them to talk through what they are defending or defending against. You might find some rich information this way. Discuss the ways in which defensiveness or resistance to new ideas gets in the way of the mission. Use your own experience with your defensiveness and resistance as an example. Brainstorm options for what the group can and will do when defensiveness and resistance shows up. 2 more points for the antidotes. One being, consider the power differences at play. When someone with a lot of power is defensive and resistant, The options are very different than when someone with less or little power is defensive and resistant. Be clear about the power dynamics in the situation and respond thoughtfully. The person with power has greater responsibility to name and move through their own defensiveness and resistance, although the collective is best served when everyone has those skills. The last point reads, know that resentment is a form of defensiveness and signals that the person feeling the resentment feels unseen and unheard or afraid of losing power. See the bullet point above. Next, we have denial shows up as. Denial is bolded and underlined and bullet points below. Denial shows up as just what it sounds like. Denying what another person is saying about the ways in which white supremacy and or racism are showing up in an interaction or space. Denial shows up as a pattern that often has a white person with different levels of power denying what a Black, Indigenous, or person of color or whole community is saying about their experience of racism. Claiming the right to defend what is and is not racism. Denial shows up as insisting that white supremacy and racism require intent, attempting to separate intent from impact in order to claim that if racism is not intended, then it is not happening. Refusing to consider or acknowledge the historical legacy of white supremacy and racism and the structural nature of racial disparities. Rewriting, reframing, or omitting histories to erase or downplay racism. Denial shows up as the refusal or the ability to feel emotional cost of racism. At worst, suggesting that the acts of violence and rage targeting BIPOC communities and or people are deserved and or necessary, and at best, ignoring or downplaying acts of violence and rage directed at BIPOC. Insisting that individually or collectively, a person or group is free from racialized conditioning, leading to statements like, I don't see color, and we're all the same. Refusing to acknowledge the benefits of belonging to the white group while generalizing about BIPOC people and communities connected to individualism. Seeing and or understanding the actions of white people as individual while generalizing the whole BIPOC groups. Refusing, for example, to acknowledge the accelerating pattern of white boys and men committing acts of gun violence while attributing danger to whole communities of color to excuse police or other violence directed at Black and brown people. The last point for how denial shows up is erasing intersectionality, generalizing about a whole group without recognizing the ways in which class, gender, sexuality, religion, age, dis/ability, and other identities inform individual and collective experiences. Take a deep breath. And some antidotes include, with more bullet points, assume that any naming of racism is on target. Instead of asking, is it or isn't it racism, ask, how is it racism? Understand deep in our bones that naming racism is the first step toward repair. Learn to acknowledge any fear that naming brings up. The feeling is not wrong or right, so that you can move through the feeling and address what has been raised. For white people, avoid taking accusations of racism or collusion in racism personally. Avoid defending yourself. Learn to say, tell me more. Understand your racism or your collusion in racism as conditioning, not who you essentially are. Understand that awareness of your conditioning is necessary if you are going to change and grow. Call yourself and others in, not out. We will not grow the movement through the shame and personal, sorry, we will not grow the movement through shame and blame, even though shame and blame are necessary elements of our individual and personal development. We will grow the movement by holding each other accountable from a position of care, kindness, and love. Sometimes we will have to employ tough love, and always the goal is to avoid throwing ourselves or anyone else away. Thank you to our beloved Cynthia Brown for this instruction. Know our history, learn our history, understand how racist patterns repeat over and over again. Take the time to learn where you live and work and love and the indigenous history of all the peoples who lived and worked and loved there before you, or live there now. Take the time to learn your own can I say this word? Indigeneity. Can't say that word. Take time to know both the history of white supremacy patterns and the stories of resistance and resilience. Plant yourself in the river of resistance and resilience. More bullet points for antidotes to how denial shows up includes learn about the history of reoccurring structural power, privilege, and benefits bestowed on the white group at the expense of BIPOC people and communities. Understand the price paid. Learn to admit when you are wrong. Understand that vulnerability can be a strength, particularly if you are sitting in a position of power and privilege. Understand that not everyone can afford to be vulnerable in the same way. Develop self-awareness and emotional intelligence so that you can take responsibility for yourself and your emotions in collective and collaborative work. This is an essential part of self-care and the link between taking care of ourselves and our ability to show up in community with integrity. Almost done to antidotes. It says take the time to understand yourself as both an individual and part of a racialized group. Take the time to understand that you are deeply informed by your racial group or groups if you are mixed roots. Understand that you are not defined by your racial group or groups. Learn to discern and respect the difference for yourself and for others. The last antidote reads, acknowledge the power of intersectionality. Being a white cisgender owning class male is a different experience than being a white gender nonconforming working class person. While the construct of whiteness and racial grouping means that we are being invited into the same construct, the invitation looks different and will be a different lived experience. Acknowledge and respect the overlaps and the differences. We are almost done with this reading. Got a few more pages, 2, 3 more pages, 4 at the most. Take a breath. The next section here says right to comfort, fear of open conflict, and power hoarding. These characteristics focus on our cultural assumption that I or we or the ones in formal and informal power have a right to comfort, which means we cannot tolerate conflict, particularly open conflict. This assumption supports the tendency to blame the person or group causing discomfort or conflict rather than addressing the issues being named. So, right to comfort shows up as bullet points. The belief that those with power have a right to emotional and psychological comfort. Another aspect of valuing logic over emotion. Scapegoating those who cause discomfort. For example, targeting and isolating those who name racism rather than addressing the actual racism that is being named. Demanding, requiring, expecting apologies or other forms of I didn't mean it when faced with accusation of colluding with racism. feeling entitled to name what is and isn't racism. White people or those with dominant identities, equating individual acts of unfairness with systemic racism or other forms of oppression. Antidotes or suggestions for how to show up in a more connecting and healing ways include understand that discomfort is at the root of all growing and learning. Welcome discomfort and learn to sit with discomfort before responding or acting. Deepen your political analysis of racism and oppression so you have a strong understanding of how your personal experience and feelings fit into a larger picture. Avoid taking everything personally versus avoid trying to take. I think that's what she meant. Everything personally. Welcome honest and hard feedback as the gift it is, knowing that people who could so easily choose to stay silent and talk about you behind your back rather than gift you with their truth of how your attitudes and or behavior are causing a problem. So remember that gift. When you have a different point of view, seek to understand what you're being told and assume there is a good reason for what is being said. Seek to find and understand that good reason without labeling the other person. Remember that feedback and criticism may be skillful or unskillful, and either way, it will not kill you. Remember that critical feedback can help you see your conditioning as you learn to separate your conditioning from who you actually are. You need to know your conditioning if you are going to be free. While your conditioning is hazardous, you are not. So for those antidotes, now we get to fear of open conflict or fear of conflict. This shows up as people in power are scared of expressed conflict and try to ignore it or run from it. When someone raises an issue that causes discomfort, the response is to blame the person for raising the issue rather than to look at the issue which is actually causing the problem. Emphasis or insistence on being polite, setting the rules for how ideas or information or differences of opinion need to be shared in order to be heard. In other words, requiring that people calm down if they're angry, when anger often contains deep wisdom about where the underlying hurt and harm lies. Fear of conflict shows up as equating the raising of difficult issues with being impolite, rude, or out of line, punishing people either overtly or subtly for speaking out about their truth and or experience. Labeling emotion as irrational or anti-intellectual or inferior, which means failing to recognize the importance of emotional intelligence. Pretending or insisting that our point of view is grounded in the rational or the intellectual, when we are in fact masking our emotions with what appear to be rational or intellectual arguments. Antidotes to these fear of conflict or suggestions of how to show up in more connecting and healing ways include role play or discuss or plan for ways to handle conflict before conflict happens. Distinguish between being polite and raising hard issues. Don't require those who raise hard issues to raise them in acceptable ways, especially if you are using the ways in which the issues, let me read that again, especially if you are using the ways in which the issues are raised as an excuse not to address them. Develop your emotional intelligence so that you can tell when you're hiding your emotions with the excuse that you are being rational. Be transparent about power so that everyone understands who makes the final decision and or how the final decision is made before you dive into the conflict. Invite a third or neutral party to support an exploration of the conflict. Assume that everyone has a good reason for their position and seek to lift those up in the light of day, to the light of day. Once a conflict is resolved, take the opportunity to revisit it and how it might have been handled differently. Here we're getting into power hoarding. It says power hoarding shows up as, this is little if any value around sharing power. Power is seen as limited, only so much to go around. Those with power feel threatened when anyone suggests changes in how things should be done in the organization, often feeling suggestions for change or reflection on their leadership. Those with power don't see themselves as hoarding power or as feeling threatened. Those with power assume they have the best interests of the organization at heart and assume those wanting change are ill-informed, stupid, emotional, inexperienced, blaming the messenger rather than focusing on the message. The last point for power hoarding includes clinging and other emotional constriction that clouds our field of vision and catapults us back into our small self with its insatiable sense of anxiety and threat. Antidotes to hoarding power include power sharing as an explicit organizational or community value. Discuss and define what good leadership looks like and include how a good leader develops the power and skills of others. If you are a leader and or hold power, understand that change is inevitable and challenges to your leadership are often healthy and productive. Adopt the tell me more approach to challenges. If you are a leader and or hold power, avoid taking challenges personally and return to the principle of collective thinking and action. Ask for help with your leadership, particularly when feeling highly defensive. If you are a leader and or hold power, realize your ability and responsibility to support others to hold power well and responsibly, to support others to be successful and to shine, to mentor and support others. Realize your ability to support and help others grow reflects well on you, as opposed to attitudes and behaviors that stem from fear, desire to control, and or micromanage. Allow yourself to feel joy in helping others grow, thrive, succeed, and even exceed you. Last few points, the antidotes to power hoarding include make sure the organization is focused on the vision, mission, and values rather than staying in business for the sake of staying in business. Last, lean into the racial equity principle of know yourself and develop strategies for making friends with your ego so that you are leading and or acting from a place of integrity rather than fear or anxiety about your importance. Next section here we have is urgency. Take a breath. It says a constant sense of urgency reflects our cultural habit of applying a sense of urgency to our everyday lives in ways that perpetuate power imbalance while disconnecting us from our need to breathe and pause and reflect. The irony is that this imposed sense of urgency serves to erase the actual urgency of tackling racial and social justice. So here we have a constant sense of urgency with bullet points. It says, makes it difficult to take time to be inclusive, encourage democratic and or thoughtful decision-making, to think and act long-term, and or consider consequences of whatever action we take. A constant sense of urgency frequently results in sacrificing potential allies for quick or highly visible results. For example, sacrificing interests of BIPOC people and communities in order to win victories for white people, seen as default or norm community. Reinforces existing power hierarchies that use the sense of urgency to control decision-making in the name of expedite, I can't say that word. There's a few words I can't say, I'm sorry. The constant sense of urgency is reinforced by funding proposals which promise too much work for too little money, and by funders who expect too much for too little. Privileges those who process information quickly, or think they do. Sacrifices and erases the potential of other modes of knowing and wisdom that require more time, be embodied, intuitive, or spiritual. It encourages shame, guilt, and self-righteousness to manipulate decision-making. Reinforces the idea that we are ruled by time, deadlines, and needing to do things in a timely way, often based on arbitrary schedules that have little to do with the actual realities of how long things take, particularly when those things are relationships with others. A few more points for a constant sense of urgency, connected to the objectivity in the sense that we think that our sense of time and or meeting deadlines is objective because we see our frame time as objective. It reproduces either or thinking because of the stated need to reach decisions quickly. Makes it harder for us to distinguish what is really urgent from what feels urgent. After a while, everything takes on the same sense of urgency, leading to mental, physical, intellectual, and spiritual burnout and exhaustion. The last point says, involves unrealistic expectations about how much can get done in any period of time, leading to perfectionism and the urgency that perfectionism creates as we try to make sure something is done perfectly according to our standards. Has a paragraph underneath that before anecdotes, and it reads, this characteristic of white supremacy is challenging because we understand that racial justice and equity is urgent. White supremacy and racism threaten, target, and violate BIPOC people and communities every day. White supremacy and racism invite and condition us into toxic thinking and behavior every day. We are called on, with this characteristic, to hold the volatile and tender contradiction of an underlying urgency about our immediate need for justice, which is with us always, with the day-to-day sense of urgency that too often defines our organizational and community cultures, leading to the consequences listed above. White supremacy culture is not urgent about racial justice. White supremacy culture is urgent in the name of short-term power and profit. And white supremacy culture likes to engender a culture of urgency, and those of us who are working to dismantle it because it knows that living with a constant sense of everything is urgent is a recipe for the abuse of power and burnout. So antidotes to a sense of urgency includes realistic work plans based on the lived experience of the people and organization involved. Leadership who understands that everything takes longer than anyone expects. A commitment to equity, including a commitment to discuss and plan for what it means to embed equity practices into the work plan. A commitment to learn from past experiences how long things take. Collaborative development for realistic funding proposals with realistic timeframes. Clarity ahead of time about how you will make good decisions in an atmosphere of urgency. This is including clarity about what constitutes a good decision. Antidotes to a sense of urgency include an understanding that rushing decisions takes more time in the long run because inevitably people who didn't get a chance to voice their thoughts and feelings will at best resent and at worst undermine a decision where they were left unheard. Developing a personal and collective practice of noticing when urgency arises and taking a pause to deliberate with thoughtfulness and intention about the nature of urgency and the range of options available to you. We are almost done with this reading. Take a breath. Next section is racial equity principles. In addition to the anecdotes listed under each of these characteristics, you will find at least 10 racial equity principles that might prove useful in thinking about how to build the culture and institutions and people we want and deserve to be. The dismantling racism works. That's underlined. Dismantling racism works. Collaborative developed these 10 racial equity principles after a decade of experience working with and for community-based leaders, organizations living to the racial justice movement. Over our years of working together, members of the collaborative added to these principles based on our evolving understanding of what we need in order to support racial justice work. We have found these principles to ground us powerfully in the wisdom they offer as we navigate these challenges, constraints, and violations of the white supremacy culture. As we build the world we want and deserve, as we become free. You can find these principles on the www.whitesupremacyculture.info website. The last section here reads, please do not weaponize this tool. I want to offer a cautionary plea here about weaponizing this list. The website, the article, and information offered here is a tool, an analytical tool designed to help us better understand white supremacy culture. The intention is to help us understand the water in which we are all swimming so that we can collaboratively work together to build and sustain cultures that help us thrive as communities and individuals. Cultures are not based on abuse of power and accumulation of profit. Cultures that are based on interdependence, justice, and respect for each other and the earth and the wind and the sun and the stars. Cultures that embody the belief that we all do better when we all do better. I remember how in my earlier years of working with Kenneth Jones to offer dismantling racism training, people would take the analysis framework we offered and use it to beat each other up. My analysis is better than your analysis. I am, or we are, more righteous than you. Similarly, some people report that this list gets used as a weapon to accuse, shame, and blame in ways that perpetrate disconnection. I believe that we are all deeply harmed by white supremacy culture. I'm asking us to sit with the devastating impacts of white supremacy culture on all of us, even though that impact is very different based on our race, our class, our gender, our sexuality, or our lived experiences. One friend reports crying after reading the list as he came to grips with the devastating impacts of white supremacy culture on his white working class family of origin as he was creating a middle class family himself. Another, a skilled facilitator, reports that I could not possibly talk about the number of hours I have spent over the last 3 years dislodging people from the reductive stance of the construct based on the tool. In its current form, just to name one area, 1999, it tilts people towards behavioral and ahistorical frame. And because it touches things in a way that can be read as absolutist, it can generate almost ridiculous orthodoxies of exclusion. I worked in one situation where the communication function had become to a grinding halt because a segment of staff had decided that editing was white supremacist. And while yes, there are elitist and racist frames around proper language, the organization was locked in an either-or frame that was incredibly unhealthy and unproductive. An activist talks about how the list has been used to scold white people, to tell white people we are inherently problematic and that our work, those of us who are white, is to never trust ourselves. A BIPOC person shares that the list is traumatizing and triggering. Working with each other across lines of difference is really hard because we cause harm. We operate out of our conditioning. We are rightfully enraged, deeply hurt, exhausted. I am not suggesting that I am not suggesting that living a racial equity commitment is clean or easy, or that this list in any way is a final word on how white supremacy culture operates. One of the challenges we face as we work together is that building justice is complex and nuanced, while white supremacy culture likes to pretend we can reduce everything to a simple either or. So we are called to navigate the complexity of our conditioning without losing sight of the inherent humanity in each of us. The movement is currently engaged in important conversations about calling in and calling out. I lean on the words of the late and fabulous and fierce and funny Cynthia Brown, a social justice warrior and beloved friend who told us with her last breath that we should never throw anyone away. This does not mean we cannot hold each other accountable. Another word for supporting each other to be our best selves. Set boundaries when people have not learned yet to take responsibility for themselves. Apologize and take responsibility ourselves when we cause harm. And continue to grow and learn how to be with each other, even when we are getting on each other's last nerve. I will say that white supremacy culture wants us to attack each other as the problem. As we fight with and amongst each other, we fail to identify the actual problem. An instruction we might hold to is to attack the problem, not the people, not each other. Author gives thanks to Calvin Allen. Of course, sometimes our behavior is a problem. Our conditioning is a problem. And then we can, when we are able, help each other through. And if we cannot, we look to others who have the capacity to help or be in relationship as they look to us when they are out of capacity and we are able to show up. I'm not pretending to have easy answers. My point is simply that I hope we can use this list to help us name the ways in which our conditioning might be getting in our own and each other's way, rather than an instrument of shame, blame, and accusation of not being good enough. The dominant culture already gives us plenty of messaging about how deficient and wrong we are. Perhaps we can learn to show up with each other with more compassion, and give ourselves and each other a break when we can't. Both and, my lovelies. Both and. Note from the original article reads, one of the purposes of listing characteristics of white supremacy culture is to point out how organizations that unconsciously use these characteristics as their norms and standards make it difficult, if not impossible, to open the door to other cultural norms and standards. As a result, many of our organizations, while saying we want to be anti-racist and multicultural, really only allow others to belong if they adapt or conform to already existing cultural norms. Being able to identify and name the cultural norms and standards you want is a step towards racial equity. The author continues to provide sources. I encourage you to look at the article itself if you have not. Remember to take some deep breaths for yourself as you have kind of really processed and digested things. Thank you for the time. Thank you for your compassion and flexibility, as even I may not always be the best reader. And so, or my pronunciation of things at times. Reflect on yourself, reflect on your strengths, remember who you are. Remember, we are all on this collective journey as humans. We carry conscious and unconscious burdens, and we are all addressing them together. Take time for yourself today. Peace be with you.